74-year-old Margaret Sterling adjusted the heavy wool scarf over her nose, her breath crystallizing instantly in the -40-degree air. Before her stretched the relentless white expanse of the Siberian taiga, a brutal, beautiful wasteland where survival was never guaranteed. Most people her age were navigating the quiet comforts of retirement communities in North America. Margaret, a former wildlife veterinarian from Vancouver, was navigating snowdrifts taller than her cabin. She had moved to this isolated corner of the world 3 decades ago with her late husband, Eric. They had been contracted by a private conservation group to study the elusive Amur leopard and the majestic Siberian tiger. Eric had passed away from a sudden heart attack 7 years ago, leaving Margaret with nothing but a solitary wooden cabin, a fiercely loyal Alaskan Malamute named Barnaby, and a stubborn refusal to leave the only place that still felt like home. The nearest human settlement was a defunct logging outpost 50 miles to the south. Her only lifeline was a crackling ham radio and a bush pilot named Richard Hayes, who dropped supplies once a month, weather permitting. But as Margaret stared at the fresh indentations in the snow just 50 yards from her front porch, she knew Richard wasn't coming anytime soon. A massive blizzard, the kind locals called a buran, was predicted to hit by nightfall, and she was no longer alone. Margaret knelt stiffly, her arthritic knees popping in protest. She brushed aside a light dusting of fresh powder to reveal a set of tracks that made her blood run cold. They were massive pug marks, easily 7 inches across. An Amur tiger. It was not entirely unusual to find tiger tracks in the region, but they rarely came this close to human habitation, unless they were desperate, starving, or sick. Margaret traced the outline of the paw print with a gloved finger. Her seasoned eyes immediately caught an anomaly. The stride was uneven. The right hind leg was dragging, leaving a continuous, shallow trench in the snow rather than a clean footprint. A wounded tiger was the most dangerous creature on the planet. Stripped of its ability to hunt its natural prey, boar and elk, a crippled predator would inevitably turn to easier targets: dogs, livestock, humans. A low, guttural whine broke her concentration. Barnaby, usually a fearless 90-pound wall of muscle and fur, was cowering on the cabin porch. His tail was tucked firmly between his legs, his nose pointed toward the dense, black tree line of the boreal forest. He smelled the apex predator, and his instincts were screaming. "Come on, Barnaby," Margaret said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Let's get inside. We have a storm to wait out." She locked the heavy oak door behind them, throwing all 3 iron deadbolts. She methodically went from window to window, pulling the heavy wooden shutters shut and latching them. The cabin plunged into a dim, amber twilight, lit only by the flickering flames of the cast-iron wood stove and a single kerosene lantern. Margaret walked over to the gun cabinet and retrieved Eric's old Winchester 30-06 hunting rifle. She hadn't fired it in years, praying she would never have to. She checked the action, loaded 5 heavy-grain cartridges into the internal magazine, and laid the weapon on the kitchen table. Outside, the wind began to howl. By 8 p.m., the storm hit with apocalyptic fury. The wind screamed through the chimney like a tortured animal, and the cabin groaned under the violent assault of snow and ice. The temperature plummeted further, forcing Margaret to pile every spare blanket she owned onto the small cot she had dragged into the main room, close to the stove. The ham radio on her desk hissed a constant stream of aggressive static. Richard had tried to hail her earlier in the afternoon, but his voice was swallowed by the atmospheric interference of the incoming front. She was completely cut off from the outside world. Barnaby refused to sleep. The dog paced the length of the cabin, occasionally stopping to sniff aggressively at the crack beneath the front door, his hackles raised in a stiff ridge along his spine. "It's just the wind, boy," Margaret whispered, though she didn't believe it herself. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the wind suddenly died down, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence in its wake. It was the eye of the storm, and in that heavy silence, Margaret heard it. Crunch, drag, crunch, drag. Footsteps on the front porch, heavy, deliberate, and agonizingly slow. Barnaby didn't bark. Instead, the dog let out a terrified whimper and scrambled under Margaret's cot, pressing his body flat against the floorboards. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slowly reached out and curled her fingers around the cold steel of the Winchester. She pulled the hammer back with a sharp, metallic click that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. Then came the smell. It seeped through the cracks of the door, a pungent, wild odor of wet fur, musk, and coppery blood. Suddenly, the front door shuddered violently. A massive weight slammed against the heavy oak. The top deadbolt groaned, the metal housing splintering the wood frame. Thud. Another strike. Margaret raised the rifle, pressing the stock firmly against her shoulder. Her hands, usually steady from decades of delicate veterinary surgery, were shaking uncontrollably. She aimed dead center at the door. She knew the ballistics. The heavy hunting round would punch straight through the wood. All she had to do was pull the trigger. Thud. Crack. The bottom hinge gave way. The door tilted inward, held only by the middle deadbolt. A massive, orange and black paw, the size of a dinner plate, swiped through the gap. Claws fully extended, gouging deep trenches into the floorboards. A terrifying roar rattled the teacups on Margaret's shelves, a sound so deep and resonant it vibrated in her chest cavity. But as the roar trailed off, it morphed into something else. A high-pitched, rattling cough. A sound of profound agony. With one final, desperate heave, the door frame splintered completely. The heavy oak door crashed to the floor, letting in a blinding swirl of snow and freezing air. There, standing in the doorway, was the beast. It was a male Amur tiger, easily weighing over 400 pounds, but it was a ghost of what it should have been. Its magnificent coat was matted with ice and dark, frozen blood. It stood swaying on 3 legs. The right hind leg was swollen to twice its normal size, wrapped tightly in a frayed, rusted steel cable, a poacher's snare that had cut deep into the bone, causing severe necrosis. Margaret stared down the barrel of her rifle, her finger resting heavily on the trigger. The tiger's massive head slowly turned toward her, its amber eyes locked onto hers. This was the moment. The predator had breached her sanctuary. It was cornered, in agony, and fully capable of closing the distance between them in a single fraction of a second, tearing her to pieces before she could even chamber a second round. "Don't move," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, don't make me do this." The tiger took a step forward. Margaret tightened her grip, closing one eye, aligning the iron sights right between the animal's eyes. But then, the tiger did something that defied every law of nature, every instinct of a wild predator, and shattered everything Margaret thought she knew about the wild. It didn't leap. It didn't bare its teeth. Instead, the massive creature let out a low, rumbling chuff, a sound tigers use for friendly greeting. It lowered its massive head, deliberately exposing the vulnerable back of its neck, and collapsed onto the wooden floorboards with a heavy thud, panting shallowly. Margaret froze. She didn't lower the gun. As the tiger laid its head on the splintered remains of her front door, the firelight from the stove caught the glint of something unnatural hidden beneath the thick ruff of fur around its neck. It wasn't a snare. It was a faded, thick leather collar. Attached to it was a heavy brass tag. Margaret lowered the rifle an inch, her mind struggling to process the visual information. Wild Amur tigers did not wear leather collars. Conservationists used thick, plastic GPS tracking collars. Only domestic or captive animals wore leather. With agonizing slowness, Margaret took a step forward. The tiger didn't flinch. It just looked at her, its amber eyes swimming with exhaustion and pain. Another step. She was now only 3 feet away. The smell of infection and blood was overwhelming. She kept the rifle leveled with her right hand and reached out with her trembling left hand, squinting to read the engraving on the tarnished brass tag. The breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to stop spinning. The engraved letters, barely legible under years of grime and scratches, read, Project Orion. Return to Eric Sterling. Iten Jobai Joshaba. The Winchester slipped from Margaret's grasp, clattering loudly against the floor. She dropped to her knees, completely ignoring the freezing snow blowing in from the open doorway. "Orion?" she whispered, the tears instantly freezing on her weathered cheeks. In the late 1990s, during the peak of the post-Soviet poaching crisis, Eric had found a half-frozen, starving tiger cub huddled next to the skinned carcass of its mother. They had brought the cub back to this very cabin. For 18 months, Margaret and Eric had hand-raised him, named him Orion, and rehabilitated him. When he was large enough, they successfully released him into a protected reserve 300 miles north. They had placed a custom leather collar on him, hoping it would deter superstitious local hunters from shooting a claimed animal. Over the years, they assumed he had either shed the collar or had succumbed to the harsh wilderness. Amur tigers rarely lived past 15 years in the wild. Orion was now almost 16, an ancient, dying king of the taiga. He hadn't come to hunt. He hadn't come to attack. Driven by the agonizing pain of the poacher's snare and the instinctual memory of his childhood, Orion had dragged his dying body across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness, seeking the only place he had ever known comfort. He had come home to his mother. "Oh, my beautiful boy," Margaret sobbed, stripping off her thick gloves and plunging her bare hands into the freezing, matted fur of his neck. Orion let out a weak rumble, closing his eyes as Margaret stroked his massive head. Barnaby, finally realizing the intruder was not a threat, cautiously crept out from under the cot, approached the dying tiger, and gently licked Orion's frozen ear. Margaret immediately shifted into veterinarian mode. "Hold on, buddy. I have antibiotics. I can cut the wire. Just hold on." She scrambled to her medical supply chest, pulling out heavy bolt cutters, syringes, and a bottle of strong penicillin. She rushed back to Orion's side. The tiger's breathing was growing incredibly shallow. The infection from the snare had advanced too far, poisoning his bloodstream. "Don't you dare leave me," Margaret pleaded, positioning the heavy bolt cutters over the rusted steel wire biting into his hind leg. With a strained grunt, she snapped the wire. Orion didn't even flinch. He just opened his amber eyes one last time, looking deeply into Margaret's face. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, and his massive chest went still. Margaret collapsed onto the tiger's body, weeping into his fur as the storm outside resumed its furious howling. She had lost Eric, and now, after 16 years, the wilderness had brought their surrogate child back to her just to tear him away again. Margaret sat on the floor for hours, her back resting against Orion's lifeless body, numb to the cold blowing into the cabin. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing embers. It was dawn when the wind finally broke. The pale winter sun crept over the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snowdrifts inside her living room. Margaret slowly forced herself to stand, her joints screaming in pain. She needed to figure out how to move him. She needed to bury him next to Eric's grave behind the cabin. As she stood up, a strange, muffled sound caught her attention. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from beneath the massive bulk of Orion's chest. Margaret froze. She knelt back down, her hands shaking as she gently wedged her fingers under the tiger's heavy front leg and lifted. Curled tightly against the residual warmth of Orion's belly, entirely shielded from the blizzard and the freezing temperatures, was a tiny, shivering ball of orange and black fur. A tiger cub. No more than 3 months old. Margaret gasped, falling backward. Male tigers do not raise cubs. In the wild, males are known to be solitary, sometimes even killing cubs to force a female back into heat. But Orion was not a normal wild tiger. He had been raised by humans. He had been taught empathy by a surrogate mother and father. Somewhere in the wilderness, the cub's mother had likely fallen victim to the same poachers who had snared Orion. And instead of abandoning the orphan, the ancient, dying tiger had used the very last ounce of his strength to carry the cub in his jaws across the taiga. He had brought the cub to the only place in the world he knew was safe. He had brought the child to Margaret. The tiny cub blinked its bright blue eyes, let out a demanding squeak, and stumbled forward on unsteady paws, sniffing blindly at Margaret's snow-covered boots. Margaret scooped the freezing cub into her arms, pressing its small, beating heart against her chest. She looked down at Orion's peaceful face, tears blurring her vision. "I've got him, Orion," she whispered into the quiet morning air. "I've got him." Outside, the harsh Siberian landscape was painted in brilliant, blinding gold by the rising sun. Margaret Sterling was alone at the edge of the world, but as she carried the tiger cub toward the warmth of the stove, she knew she finally had a reason to survive.